When you think of fantasy cities, those rogue landmasses of immense stature, advanced technologies, and unique, if not magical, populations, what first comes to mind? Atlantis, El Dorado, Lemuria, Agartha. What about the lost city of Norumbega? The little discussed lost city of Norembega or Norumbega is much more than simply a massive castle in a place that it shouldn't be. It is a land shrouded in mystery, founded in the New World, said to have consisted of many quote unquote New World structures, all of which seem to be pre existing to both European settlers who arrived in the area and the other Native American tribes of the area, which are said to have avoided it at all costs. Now, the first depiction of Norembega is said to have occurred in 1529 on Giovanni de Verrazzano's map of America. At this time, Norembega, spelled Orembega, is said to have consisted of massive homes with pillars and domes made of gold, and the residents of Norembega are said to have been equipped with the finest of jewelry, including a deep connection with the pearl, which was worn by nearly every adult on their headwear and clothing. From this account, not only can we establish that the residents of Norembega appeared much more advanced than others at the time period, but we can assume that the vast majority of Norembega were a seafaring people, as their collection of pearls and other tools from the sea imply their continued growth in that area. Also of note, and what led me to want to find out a little bit more, is the amount of detail written about these mysterious people of Norembega. From these earliest accounts, we can make out great details about the lifestyle and the amenities which the Norembega had at their disposal. Of course, we can assume that this meant at least one explorer or settler had encountered this mysterious land. However, as the narrative goes, there are no details of exactly when this occurred, who the explorer was who found out all these details about the Norembega, and when this phantom city was deemed to progress from a real, discovered city into one of myth and legend. So today, we will take a brief look at the Norwegian Narrative that I found about Norembega, which really illustrates a much more detailed narrative than what we've been told in the mainstream, and it alludes to Norway possibly having not only ties to the earliest city of Norembega, but possibly ties to being the first explorers to reach the New World. Now, I will leave a link for this website down below, but first let's discuss the current narrative history a little bit more. Norembega, depicted on maps as a walled-off castle city or starfort city, appears on a river which was aptly named Norembega River. This occurs on countless maps of the New World, aka America, from the 1500s through the 1600s mainly. To this day, scholars have yet to be able to identify exactly which river was known as the Norembega, and thus they have yet to unearth any remains of this magical city. That being said, in the earliest maps of this area, we can see that Norembega is nearly always labeled as part of New France. While my French speaking is little to none, I was able to identify at least 50 books or so available for free from museums, written in French, detailing Norembega. I will provide some links down below, and if there are any French-speaking viewers of my videos who might want to take the time to browse these old French history books, there could possibly be some really useful information in there that I would love to share with the rest of the community. So if you find anything, please let me know. That being said, I was unable to find any definitive accounts of Norembega that had been translated directly from French into English, or accounts that were written directly by French soldiers or explorers. I'd definitely like to hear about it if you could find anything, but at this point, at least according to the narrative and according to the maps from nearly all countries in the early 1600s, this area that today we call New England was world renowned as this land of Norembega. Basically, everybody seemed to know this area as Norembega. Now, the history of this mystical city seems to be forgotten around this time, and the name seems to be adopted as a way to smooth over or possibly cover up the history. And I will discuss that later in the video, but many small towns and businesses that began to spring up in the area of quote unquote New England in the 1700s and later began to use the name of Norumbega in their companies and in their towns. So basically, it convoluted the true history of what Norumbega really was. Now, before diving into that part of the video, I wanted to get back into this Norwegian narrative, as I'll refer to it. I won't read you the whole thing, but I will leave a link down below if you want to check it out, and I'll try to give you the gist of it. It's so interesting, and it diverges from the current narrative quite a bit. So, this article, this Norwegian narrative, begins by stating that before England arrived to Norembega, or the New World, most of the residents of that area were Catholic and they spoke Norse. And I found that interesting to say the least. Now, this article explains that in 1204, Håkon IV of Norway is actually born in far eastern Norembega. Now, due to his mother being the mistress of the king at the time, who was Håkon III, she fled to the newly discovered Norse lands that were overseas. These lands were known in Norse as Norvegar, and Norvegar had been discovered only a few decades before Håkon IV was born there. Now, they say Norvegar was discovered by Norwegian Christians who were persecuted by European aristocrats, and they fled Europe for what they called the Isle of the Western Sea. Here in America, or in Norembega, the narrative says Håkon IV is born, and he actually grows up and lives the beginning of his life in the western expanse of Norway's kingdom, aka Norembega, until he must officially take the Norwegian throne in 1247. When discussing Håkon IV of Norway and this Norwegian narrative as compared to the current narrative, this is where things get really wild, and I found 4 main factors that I wanted to point out. 1. The current narrative, aka modern history, says that Håkon IV was born in Norway, in a tiny town that seems to only be famous for his birth. And while there are no records of his exact birth date given, or any other substantiating factors about his birth, he is said to have never visited America, at least according to the current mainstream English narrative. Number 2, the Norway narrative, or Norwegian narrative, says that only 20 days at sea were needed to row from Norway to America. At the same time, it says only 6 days of continuous sea travel were needed in the trip, meaning that the Norwegians had a great concept of navigation and would stay along the coastlines as much as they could, traveling up one coastline and crossing the sea at its most narrow or easiest to cross portion. This is absolutely fascinating to me when you take into account that in this Norwegian narrative, they claim that Norwegians at the time did not believe in map making or cartography and traveled the world simply by memory and calculations done within their heads. This lack of map making is pointed to in the Norwegian narrative as one of the reasons why other countries were able to later come into this land and claim it as their own discovery, even though, based off this Norwegian narrative, this land of Norembega was strictly a Norwegian stronghold. Now that brings me to number 3. For Italian, Portuguese, and really any other country's cartographers to travel to Norembega, according to this Norwegian narrative, they were escorted by Norwegian sailors. This narrative even goes on to claim that the first map that was made of America was only possible because the Norwegian king sent a large convoy from Norembega to Europe to pick up European explorers and bring them back to Norumbega. This narrative even states that in 1476, a certain somebody was on one of these early Norwegian vessels packed with Europeans traveling to explore America. This certain somebody was Christopher Columbus, and this initial experience in the New World led him to conduct his own 1492 travel to America. So I take it all with a grain of salt, but at this point in the Norwegian narrative, my mind is really blown. We have Norembega, which for all intents and purposes is being called the Western Kingdom of Norway, according to this narrative. And the Norwegians are an easygoing and seafaring people who do not believe in writing down history or cartography, and thus, when aristocratic European explorers arrive, they are easily able to claim the land as their own. Now, what really struck me right in the back of the head with this narrative is that after Haakon IV is summoned back to Norway in the Norwegian narrative to become the official king, it said that the mini ice age of the Middle Ages occurs, and both regions of Norembega and Norway are greatly affected. Now that brings me to number 4. According to this Norwegian narrative, this mini ice age entirely changes the course of the sea. It freezes up many ancient routes that the Norwegians knew by heart, including their direct route from Norway to Norembega. At this time, it's written, nearly all travel to the New World from Norway ceased. And according to the Norwegian narrative, the Norwegian kingdom in America lost much of its power and connection to the larger part of Europe. Many others would attempt to travel the ancient Norway passage to America, but they would fail. They would either find that it stops or it was frozen. And it was only when the Norwegians from Norembega set out to reach Norway once again in the early 1400s that new routes to cross the sea were discovered, traveled, and perfected. So they say when all the European settlers began to arrive to the quote-unquote New World, this was again facilitated by the Norwegians from Norembega. So at this point, we're told that European settlers from all different countries and European explorers basically adopted these new Norwegian routes to get from Europe to the New World. And at this point, we have different countries from Europe that are coming into America and coming into Norembega and laying claim to this land. So we don't have much more that is written about it after that. We're not told whether the people of Norembega assimilated into the cultures that were beginning to flourish around them, but we do have this idea presented beginning in the 1700s that Norembega never existed. And that's kind of the idea that the mainstream maintains today. We have English explorers coming in around this time, traveling all around New England, saying that they have gone up and down these rivers looking for Norembega, and basically they can find no evidence of Norembega existing. So that is the narrative we're told beginning in the 1700s, and at this same time, which I'm going to get into in the final part of the video, we have different companies and towns, businesses in New England that begin to use the name of Norembega, and they begin to adopt it basically. And at this point, I believe that was done to convolute the history about Norembega. So there you have it. According to this narrative, Norembega and a large portion of America was a kingdom of Norway, and this kingdom was full of riches during the warm period in the Middle Ages, and this kingdom flourished. However, with the mini ice age of the 1300s and the Black Plague epidemic, Norembega and this Norwegian kingdom lost most of its power and connection with the rest of the world. The area went somewhat dormant, although other native groups of America appeared to avoid Norembega at all costs. With weather beginning to improve by the 1400s, the remote people of Norembega set out again to reach Europe. On doing so, according to this narrative, they discovered more new sea paths from America to Europe, which would become the routes that were traveled by the much more famous European explorers. Once the other European countries arrived to Norumbega and saw the large castle-like structures and immense city with little to no power struggle, these other countries were able to take over and eventually create the New England that we see today. Now, many places claim to be the historic site of Norembega, if not with much jest. According to historians, if Norembega existed, it had to have been in the New England area, although I'm of the belief it could have been in a much wider range, or quite a distance away from modern-day New England, given the age and process of making the 1500s maps. With no exact location ever being discovered, the mysterious land of Norembega has been continuously debated by scholars and those who haven't forgot about it. As with many aspects of the old world history, we may never know exactly where Norembega was, or even have an idea of the sheer immensity of its construction. One thing we do know, at least according to this Norwegian narrative, is that many different countries have an aspect of Norembega in their history. Many different countries laid claim to Norembega without ever actually giving us a full description of the land or people. While we have fleeting mentions of houses of gold and people dressed in fine jewelry, were there really pillars made of gold? Were there really castles reaching to the sky? Was there really an infrastructure already built with fully furnished streets? Was this a tale of madness and excess written by power-hungry explorers who were looking for a story? Can we ever actually find evidence of the pre-existing city of Norembega in places like Boston, Bangor, and other New England cities? Are there proofs of the Norwegian narrative tucked behind the history which we have been presented in the mainstream? These are all questions I pose with little to no ability to answer them at this time. The one thing I do know, the lost city of Norembega is more than worthy of a little bit more old world research. And in my own personal opinion, I believe that the fort of Norembega, the walled city, did really exist, and furthermore could have been much more illustrious than even the Norwegian narrative gives it credit for. With all the massive cities of America appearing like phoenixes from the ashes of Native American cultures, I do find it very interesting that we are now discovering even more evidence that alludes to massive building projects in America before well-documented history occurred. Whether it's the Lenape in Philadelphia with the help of the Swedish, or the Susquehannock in Baltimore, or even the ancient Norwegians in what is now New England, we have all different stories, all different angles to these narratives, which we are smoothing over with our research every day. And I certainly believe, even with all the questions that have arisen in this narrative, that we are still tearing apart what the current narrative has given us and finding out even more hidden truths about our past and these old ancient cultures. So, in conclusion, I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to watch and, with this video, to listen. I appreciate any comments you'd like to share about the video or the subjects discussed within, and I look forward to being able to expand on these ideas with you in the future. I'm planning on doing a video about Boston soon, more specifically on the old railway systems of Boston, and that should have a few ties back to Norembega, which I did not include in this video. So be on the lookout for that video very soon, and I will talk to you on the next one. Thank you so much for being here. Jared Boosters out.